with us this morning, worshiping God with us together. I love this time of the year. We get to see people that we haven't seen for a little while, and you can always count on extended family being in. The Walker children are here, and their spouses and their children, and Josh and Liz are back in town with our new addition here, their new addition, which is our new addition, Jasper. And we're thankful that they're back and safe, and that Angie's back with them. And she's sitting in the middle of her pew with all of her children and their spouses and her grandbaby just down the way. What a blessing it is to be together. What a privilege to be a part of the family of God. And what a joy to share together with all these great things. I invite you to open your Bibles to Mark, the 5th chapter. It's where we'll be taking the text from this morning. We're going to spend the majority of our time there in Mark 5. And I am not using PowerPoint this morning. For those of you who wonder why I don't, I know that some of you prefer PowerPoint because it helps you to be able to follow along. I know that mothers who are dealing with children who are not always cooperative, or fathers, got to say that now. I mean, it used to be that it was almost always the case that it was the mom who was dealing with the baby. And thanks be to God that younger fathers have learned the responsibility that they have to be a help to their wives and have taken that role in cases too. And so young mothers or young fathers have trouble trying to pick back up where they left off when they're trying to deal with an uncooperative child. And so I understand the reasons why people like it. The reason I don't like it is because it marries me to an outline that I feel like I have to stick to. And I don't like that. I like to have the ability, if I choose to go in a different direction than I'd originally planned. And if I've got it on a PowerPoint slide, I feel like I have to say what's on the slide so that the lesson matches what I've put down. And so I don't like that. And so that's why I don't use it, if you wondered why I've stopped. In Mark chapter 5, we're going to begin reading in verse 21, not because that's where we're actually going to start the lesson, but because it's the context. In Mark 5, verse 21 beginning, "Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live.' So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment, for she said, 'If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.' And immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' But his disciples said to him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, Who touched me?' And he looked around to see who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.' And while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' And as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. And when he came in, he said to them, "Why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. But when he had put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cumi," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given to her to eat. If we look at this text, and I think most of the time when we talk about this particular section of Mark 8, or the accounts of it in Matthew or Luke's gospel, usually the focus is on Jairus and Jairus' daughter, the leader of the synagogue, the ruler of the synagogue. And we may have our reasons for that being the focus of it. Maybe it's because the daughter's raised from the dead. I mean, what could be greater than someone who was dead coming back to life again? But couched in the middle of this is a story about a woman. And it's kind of mentioned in passing as we read the story of Jairus. And I don't think it's mentioned in passing because it's less significant. In fact, maybe it's exactly where it is to draw attention to what happens with this woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years. Because in the prominent story of Jairus and Jairus' daughter and the resurrection of the child from the dead, we have this woman whom likely the society that she lived in had forgotten about. If they thought about her at all, it was to say, you need to stay away from us because you're unclean. Now, you see, according to the law of Moses, a woman who was during her flow of blood, as it's referred to in Leviticus, was considered unclean. And this woman has had a continual flow of blood for 12 years. And so for 12 years, she's been unclean, unable to touch other people, unable to be involved in the community because of the danger of causing other people to be unclean. And so she would likely have been shunned, maybe even secluded from her family. I don't know how they dealt with that. We know a little bit more about the way they would have dealt with something like leprosy, but we're not as clear about how they would have dealt with this particular instance. But likely some of the same rules or laws would have applied, traditions, in order to keep others from becoming unclean. And so we see this woman who's had an issue of blood for 12 years, who's been secluded from physical touch in society and all the things that we thrive on as people created in the image of God, who are social and relational in our being, to our core. And so she's desperate. And we can see the desperation in the woman in the fact that she has spent every dime that she has going to doctors to try to find a cure for this condition that she's suffering from. And she hasn't had any luck with all that she's tried to do and all that these doctors have tried to do. In fact, the text tells us clearly, not only did she not get well, she actually was made worse. And I don't think it's likely that it was the last doctor who made it worse. It's probably gotten worse throughout the process. And so even as the condition grew worse and worse and nothing seemed to help, she kept spending her money, kept doing everything she possibly could because she needed to be healed. And nothing worked. And so she makes another desperate attempt. This time she's heard stories about a Jewish rabbi. She's heard stories about a rabbi that's been in town, and he's been There's stories about him healing people who have suffered from diseases. And she thinks, if I could just get close to him. And unlike Jairus, she doesn't have any status. For one, she's a woman. Jews didn't look highly on women, even Jewish women. She's not, she doesn't have any notoriety. She doesn't come from a prominent family where we would have her name mentioned here in the text. But she thinks, if only I can get close to this teacher. And I want you to see the nature of her faith. I know we see what Jesus says to her later, but I want you to see the nature of her faith in what she says. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him, verse 27, in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, if only I touch his clothes, I shall be made well. She doesn't say, maybe if I touch him, maybe I'll be better. Maybe I'll get well. She says, if only I can get to him. If only I can get there. If only I can touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And so in her desperation, likely essentially ignoring a number of perhaps laws in the law of Moses, certainly traditions in the traditions of the people, she works her way. Remember, there's a crowd of people around Jesus. In fact, so much so that when Jesus says, who touched me, the apostles almost laugh at him. You're asking who touched you? I mean, who hasn't touched you? There's so many people around you that are just piling in on you. Why would you ask who touched you? We know why Jesus did. But that's how many people are around. And she's pushing her way through this crowd, at least in violation of the traditions of the people and what would be considered politically correct in the day. And she's pushing her way to this Jewish rabbi that she knows she has no right to. She wouldn't ask for him. She has nobody else to appeal to him on her behalf. But if she can just get there, and just as he is walking the other way, just reach in and grab his clothes, I know I shall be made well. And so she does that. And then Jesus does what she had hoped nobody would do. He catches her in the act. He somehow felt the power that healed her leaving his body. And he said, who touched me? And of course, I said, as I said already, the apostles laughed at him. Who didn't touch you? No, I felt power go out from me. Who was it that touched me? He says to the crowd. And the woman, we're told in the text, comes before him fearing and trembling, as if she wasn't scared enough already in what she had done. Now the rabbi has called her out, and she's going to have to come clean. And so she comes before him with fear and trembling. She's scared to death. And she lets him know what she did. She tells him the whole truth of what had happened. In verse 34, Jesus turns to this nobody whom society had rejected because of this disease that she suffered from. And he looks at her and he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." I don't know what she must have felt like to have had that 12-year issue of blood taken away. I mean, that had to have felt great in and of itself. The physical relief, the knowledge that she no longer had to be separated from society, she could finally be with other people again, perhaps her own people, had to be wonderful. But to have this Jewish rabbi look at you and not reprimand you for violating all these traditions or for sneaking up unawares and taking advantage of him, but to have this Jewish rabbi instead look at you and say, daughter. I wonder what that felt like. We talk about questions we'll ask when we get to heaven. Maybe if I see that woman in heaven, I'll ask her, what did it feel like when Jesus looked at you and said, daughter? Probably not. I probably will forget all about it by the time I get there. But what must that have felt like to her? And you have to kind of put yourself in her shoes and try to understand at least a little bit what it must have been like for her in the society that she lived in. And to hear him say, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. He didn't reprimand her. Didn't call attention to all the laws that she had or traditions that she had violated. He calls her a daughter. In the last few minutes of our time together, I want us to think about some lessons for us. Because that's really what this is all about. It's not about reading a touching story about a woman who suffered from an issue of blood years ago. The point of those stories is to show us something greater and better and bolder for not only what it meant for her and how it certainly changed her life, but what it means for us. So I want us to take just two. I know that's not the Church of Christ tradition. 3 is the tradition, but I'm going to give you 2. 2 lessons. And one of them really can be for anybody. But if you are a person who has not obeyed the gospel yet, and you don't have a relationship with God, you're not in Christ, and you have suffered and struggled through life, and you, like this woman, have tried everything you can think of on your own. You've done it every way you can possibly imagine and dream. And things aren't getting better. In fact, if you're like I was when I was trying to do that, things got worse. Then, like this woman, realize that Jesus is the one who provides hope in hopelessness and peace in the midst of turmoil. And like this woman, lay hold of him. What is impossible for men to fix, whether it's this woman or the doctors or you and I in our lives, what it is impossible for us to fix, Jesus has more than enough power to wipe the slate clean and to fix everything that we have ailing us. And specifically, he has promised to fix our spiritual ailments. Jesus has the power to make your life better. Whatever it is that you've struggled with, whatever it is that you've suffered from, Jesus can provide hope in the midst of hopelessness. I know we've all experienced people in the church who have suffered horrific diseases in life. And some of them haven't been healed of those diseases. They have succumbed to them ultimately. But it is amazing watching the hope that exists in the midst of those who are faithful to God as God's people who go through those situations that most of the world would see as hopeless and lacking peace. And yet there is a hope and a peace that carries them through it. I'm not saying they don't have struggles, but you can see the difference in someone who truly has a relationship with God and is trusting in them, even in the midst of hopelessness from the world's perspective. Jesus provides that. Jesus and a relationship with him carries us through the struggles that we face now and ultimately provides a way for us to be with Him eternally in perfect peace and a realization of all we could ever hope for. And so if you're not a Christian, this is an opportunity. This is not the only opportunity, but this is an opportunity for you to, like the woman in the story, lay hold of what Jesus has done for you and have that peace and that hope. But that's also something we as people of God can learn from too. Because I know firsthand there are things in my life that I've looked at that I thought were too small for God to need to deal with. He probably expects me to deal with this myself. And so He wants me to just take care of this. I just need to buck up and get the work done. And the reality is that what I've found, and I'm not talking about 25 years ago, I'm talking about in recent time. Having been a Christian for a couple decades, at almost 50 years of age, I've thought this. And what I've come to realize is that even in the things that I think are little, that God would want me to just take care of myself, God expects me to have the humility to lean on Him and realize I still need His strength, even for the little stuff. And so I've tried it my way. I've prayed about it, and I've tried to be more diligent in my dedication and in my work, only to find that I kept failing. And I came to realize the reason I kept failing is because I was trying to do it of my own strength instead of having the humility to recognize that even in the little stuff I need God. And so I've had to lay hold of the strength that God can provide and the wisdom that God will provide for those even who are His people who are struggling through the things that we struggle through in this life. So we need to come to the realization this woman did in our desperation that we are spiritually bankrupt without Christ. That's one of the Beatitudes, the idea of being poor in spirit. It's the idea of being spiritually bankrupt. Without God, we are nothing, we have nothing, and we can do nothing. I know we have a tendency in the church to really emphasize that we have to have a faith that works, and that's true. That's true. And we are to work diligently. We can look at the life of Paul and the life of others who worked diligently in all that they did, and yet it is clear when you look at the life of Paul that Paul realizes that nothing he accomplished was of his own wisdom or of his own strength. It was all through the grace of God and the help that God provided. And we as God's people have to get to that point and that realization. We need God every minute, every hour, every day of our life. And there's something else to be learned from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. We talked about a point this morning in Bible class, and I almost brought this up. But Jesus talks about in the model prayer, verse 11, Matthew 6, give us this day our daily bread. We like to plan ahead. We like to think down the road. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with planning. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be faithful from this moment till the end of my life. But here's the reality of it. You know how long I have to be faithful? I have to be faithful today. For some of us, today is as much as we can deal with. And I know that because we have some older people who struggle through the day because of their physical health. But there are other people who struggle through the day because of emotional and spiritual health. They look at it and it's overwhelming to think about the idea, maybe at their age, whether it's 50 or 30 or 20 or 16, they think about how hard it will be to be faithful to God for the rest of our life You don't have to worry about that. You just have to worry about today. You just need to pray to God and spend time with God in a relationship with God today. And work on making today what God wants it to be. And then tomorrow, if it gets here, you can do the same thing again. You just rinse and repeat over and over and over again until the end. And as you do that, you'll tack on weeks, months, maybe some years, maybe decades of faithfulness to God. But you just got to worry about today. And God can give you the strength to help you through the day. I know because when I will get off my high horse and stop thinking about how smart and strong I am and realize how much I need God's help, God helps me through the day. He'll help me to be steadfast and steady through today. And that's all I've got to worry about. So we need to get to the point of being desperate enough in our attempts at doing it ourselves that we realize how much we need Jesus. The passage in John 6 that Chip read for us at the beginning of the lesson, I chose that verse. It's in the midst of a context where Jesus has fed 5,000 people, and the people tried to take him by force and make him king. And then he began teaching about the fact that they had to eat his flesh and drink his blood, and this saying was really hard for them. They obviously clearly misunderstood it, and so it was really difficult for them. And verse 66 is where we picked up in the reading, and it says, from this time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. As they listened to this difficult teaching, they walked away. So much so that Jesus looks at the 12 and says, will you also depart from me? Will you also leave me? Are you going to go away also? And we look at it and we think, well, no, the apostles knew who he is. Did they really? I mean, really. Think about it. I know what Peter says. I know what his response is. It's not the last half of the response in 69 I want us to focus on. It's verse 68 that I want us to focus on. But we know what he says. And we have come to believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what he says. And there's some sense in which, on some level at least, they understood that that was true. I don't think they fully understood what it really meant yet. And I say that because of all the things that happened after this. The ways in which they forsake him and betray them in their words and in their conduct throughout the rest of his life before his death. They didn't really understand, but they understood what really mattered in verse 68. And that's what this woman understood too. They understood what really mattered in verse 68. Peter's response is, where would we go? Where would we go? Well, we may not understand everything about you, but where else can we go? There's nobody else that has the words of eternal life. You're it. That is the key, ultimately, is for each of us to realize there is nowhere else we can turn. I think it's Acts 4, about verse 12. Peter says, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. There's no one else who can do the work. There's no one else who can accomplish the task. There's no one else who brings true hope and true peace except Jesus. And we need to get desperate enough in our lives, whether we've obeyed the gospel or not, to recognize that Jesus is the answer to all of your problems, whatever they are. Jesus is the solution to whatever ails you, whatever you're struggling with. Jesus is the one who can provide peace and strength and wisdom and hope. The second lesson I want us to take from this, though, is the importance of seeing people as Jesus did. And this one's a little harder for us, I think. Maybe not. But it's important for us to grow to see people the way Jesus saw them. Everybody else, if they had seen this woman, they likely would have known who she was, and they would have gotten away from her as fast as they could, and probably would have been yelling at her and screaming at her to get back away from the crowd. But not Jesus. She comes in and touches his garment, and when he turns, as we said before, he doesn't reprimand her. He doesn't call attention to all the traditions she's violated. He doesn't talk about the invasion of his personal space and privacy. He looks at her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." We have a tendency to be like the people in society would have been. We have a relationship with God. We've been cleansed. And I think sometimes it's harder for us the older we get, because the further we get from who we used to be to where we are now, the easier it becomes to kind of develop a self-righteous attitude that we're better than other people who suffer with these things. And again, I'm talking to myself. It is easy for me in some instances to look at certain types of sin and think, how can you struggle with that? How is that a problem for you? I'm just telling you that. I mean, it's the honest truth. How can that be a problem for you? That just doesn't make any sense to me. But the reality is that every sin that we commit, whatever form it takes, I think Jeff's made the comment before about the fact that the Narcotics Anonymous people look at or I guess it's the other way around, the Alcoholics Anonymous people look at the Narcotics Anonymous people and think, what is wrong with you? They suffer from the same problem. And the reality is that no matter who you are, no matter what it is that you've done, no matter what sins you've committed in your life, we all have the same problem. And we were all just as dead without Christ before we came to Him for the cleansing through His blood. And so how can we, who are ultimately in the same boat as all of humanity, ever look down on people and not treat them with the compassion of Jesus? We're going to have to get our hands dirty. And we're going to have to realize, in some cases, the gentle, tender approach that is necessary in trying to pick somebody up out of the ash heap and lead them to the Lord. And in most cases, it's probably not going to come by just telling them they're going to hell if they keep doing what they're doing. There may be people who respond to that. But most people are going to need to be shown and led, and that's going to require the tenderness that Jesus had and the compassion that He had in approaching this woman. And so we can learn from the way that Jesus dealt with people, even people that society would have looked at and said, you really don't have to treat her like that. You really don't have to be that kind to her. And so we can learn from Him how we ought to be with those who are struggling in sin. Yeah, some of them have done it of their own free will. They've made stupid choices and they know better. Okay? You haven't done that? Maybe they weren't the same stupid choices, but you still made choices that you knew better than doing, and you did it anyway. They need the gospel. And they may not even see that they need the gospel. But if Jesus is the solution to our problems and the help for our struggles, He's also the help for their struggles and their problems too. And we need to lead them to the point of seeing how much they need the Savior of men. So we can learn something about us and about our approach and our relationship with God. And we can also learn something about our approach to our neighbor. Funny, isn't it? Ethan might be right. That it all boils down to two main principles. Loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Amazing how that works out. If you're here this morning and in some way need our help, our encouragement, if you need to obey the gospel this morning and put on Christ in baptism because you know that without Him you have nothing and you want to have what He has promised and provides. And we'd like to help you in obeying the gospel. If we can help you in any way this morning, encourage you in some way, let us know while together we stand and sing.